The room smells of oil lamps and crushed rose petals. Your hands are shaking so badly, you can barely hold the ceremonial cloth they've draped across your arms. Behind you, 7 people stand in absolute silence, their shadows stretching across the marble floor like dark witnesses. Your mother kissed your forehead 3 hours ago and whispered something that sounded like an apology. Your husband, a man you've met twice, stands near the doorway, his face unreadable. And in the corner, covered by a crimson veil, something waits. Something no one explained during all those weeks of wedding preparation. Something that's about to teach you what Roman marriage truly means. Before we step further into this night, I'm genuinely curious where you're listening from right now. It amazes me that a ritual from 2,000 years ago can reach people across continents. Drop a comment and let me know it never stops blowing my mind. The year is 91 CE. The Emperor Domitian rules Rome with an iron fist and a reformer's zeal, claiming to restore traditional morality to an empire he believes has grown decadent. For 18-year-old Flavia Marcella, this means her wedding night will be conducted exactly as Roman law prescribes, with every ancient ritual observed, every witness requirement fulfilled, every legal formality honored. Her father signed the contracts 6 weeks ago, transferring her from his patri potestas, his legal authority, to her husband's manus, his hand. The language was precise. The dowry was calculated. The property boundaries were defined, because that's what this is. Not a celebration of love, but a transfer of property. And the property being transferred is her. The procession through Rome's streets had been beautiful in a strange, almost violent way. She wore the flame-colored flammeum veil that every bride before her had worn, her hair arranged in 6 braids bound with wool ribbons in the ancient semi-crine style that hadn't changed in 5 centuries. Young men in the crowd sang fescennine verses songs so obscene they made her face burn beneath the veil. They described in graphic detail what would happen to her body tonight. Her mother had explained this was meant to ward off evil spirits through the power of laughter and shame. But Flavia noticed her mother wasn't laughing. She was walking beside the procession with her eyes fixed on the cobblestones, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. They reached the house as the last light died. Her husband Marcus Valerius Severus, a wool merchant 23 years her senior, lifted her over the threshold, because tradition said a stumbling bride brought misfortune. The door closed behind her, muffling the singing outside, and she finally saw what was waiting in the atrium. An elderly woman in formal robes. A pronuba, they called her, a married woman of impeccable reputation, whose role Flavia didn't yet understand. A priest carrying a small clay lamp. 3 female slaves with basins of water and folded linen. A middle-aged man with a leather bag resting at his feet, the kind physicians carried. And in the corner, still draped in crimson cloth, that shape, roughly 4 feet tall, unmistakably vertical, waiting. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands. Her grip was firm, almost restraining, as though she expected resistance. "Welcome to your husband's house," she said. "The sacred rites must now be completed. The gods must bless what the law has begun." Here's what almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It wasn't primarily about love, companionship, or even sex. It was a legal transaction documented with the same precision Rome applied to the sale of land or ships. Roman law classified marriage as conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand, which meant a woman passed from her father's ownership to her husband's. In the early republic, this transfer had been absolute. A husband held the same legal power over his wife that he held over his slaves, including, theoretically, the power of life and death. By the imperial period, when Flavia walked that torch-lit path, the law had softened somewhat. Women of her class could own property. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's authority to another's, and like all significant property transfers in Rome, it required verification. Think about how Romans handled the sale of a farm. Witnesses observed the transaction. The land was surveyed to confirm it matched the seller's description. Boundaries were walked. Rituals invoked divine protection. Documents were sealed. Everyone involved understood exactly what was being exchanged, what condition it was in, what it was worth. The Romans applied this same logic to marriage, with one crucial addition. A farm's value lay in its soil and crops. A bride's value lay in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the resource being purchased. And Roman law required that both be verified before the transaction could be considered complete. The pronuba guided Flavia toward the draped figure. Flavia's pulse hammered in her throat. The woman's hand on her arm allowed no retreat, no hesitation. "You must greet Mutunus Tutunus," the pronuba said quietly. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as the ancestors require." Flavia reached out with trembling fingers and pulled back the cloth. What stood beneath was carved from dark wood, polished smooth by countless hands, shaped with anatomical precision into the form of a phallus. But this wasn't a small amulet like the ones that hung around children's necks to ward off the evil eye. This wasn't a garden statue meant to frighten thieves. This figure was sized deliberately, proportioned carefully, mounted on a sturdy base. And the pronuba was already explaining, in a voice that was clinical, almost bored, exactly what Flavia was required to do with it. Mutunus Tutunus was Rome's god of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because multiple ancient sources mention him, always briefly, always with visible discomfort. St. Augustine, writing 3 centuries later as Christianity was conquering pagan Rome, described the practice with barely contained outrage. Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutunus Tutunus as a sacred duty before consummation with their husbands. The ritual was performed in the presence of witnesses who would later testify if the marriage was challenged. Augustine was a hostile source, writing to condemn paganism, but his description matches fragments from earlier non-Christian texts. Lactantius, another church father, called it so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. Arnobius provided the most detailed account, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem while their new husbands looked on. Varro, the great Roman antiquarian writing centuries before Christianity with no religious agenda, mentioned Mutunus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented using language that implied physical contact without explicitly describing it. Modern historians who address this ritual at all tend to minimize it, suggesting the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language of the ancient sources doesn't support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine's word was insedere, which means to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius used phrasing that implied penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details because they were too obscene, which seems an excessive reaction to someone briefly touching a statue. The stated purpose was divine blessing for fertility. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was preparation. It was breaking down resistance. It was demonstrating absolute submission before witnesses. It was conditioning a virgin bride to accept what would follow with her husband. It was, in the cold logic of property transfer, ensuring the merchandise could perform its function. The pronuba positioned Flavia's body, guided her movements, instructed her in what was required with the same tone she might use to explain how to properly arrange flowers for a household shrine. The witnesses watched. Marcus watched from near the doorway, his face flushed. The physician waited, expressionless. And Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused, theoretically, but refusal meant disgrace for her family, nullification of the contracts, return to her father's house as damaged goods no respectable man would marry. It meant everything she'd been taught about duty, honor, and family would be proven worthless. It meant she would be proven worthless, so she didn't refuse. She closed her eyes, gripped the pronuba's supporting hands, and did what tradition demanded. Afterward, the slaves washed her in basins of scented water. This washing had religious significance, purifying her after contact with the divine. But it was also practical preparation for what came next. The physician approached. His name was Glaucus, and he'd examined hundreds of brides. This examination was not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property, and Flavia's dowry of 30,000 sesterces certainly qualified, a respectable Roman bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virginal status. The examination was documented. The documentation became part of the legal record, establishing the bride's value and protecting both families from fraud. If a bride was found not to be a virgin, the marriage could be annulled and the dowry reclaimed. If a husband later claimed his wife had deceived him about her purity, these medical records would be evidence in court. Roman medical text described the techniques used with clinical precision that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. Soranus of Ephesus, whose gynecological manual was the standard reference, detailed exactly how to verify virginity through physical examination. This wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't symbolic. It was invasive, methodical, and conducted in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged. Glaucus performed 2 examinations that night. The first verified that the ritual with Mutunus Tutunus had been properly completed, that Flavia's physical state was consistent with what tradition required. The second would come later, after consummation with Marcus, to confirm that the marriage had been legally perfected. Both examinations were documented. Both were witnessed. Flavia lay on the wooden table while strangers discussed her body as though she weren't present, using technical terminology that reduced her to anatomical features and legal categories. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions isn't just their invasiveness, but their casualness. The Romans didn't view these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property doesn't have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures, and feelings don't appear in legal documents. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber. The room had been decorated according to tradition, with the marriage bed positioned for optimal visibility from the doorway, which would remain open throughout. Oil lamps provided sufficient light for the pronuba to observe from her station near the entrance. The slaves who would be needed afterward waited in the corridor. Marcus entered. He seemed nervous, which surprised Flavia. She'd assumed he would be confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. He was, she realized, performing too. Not for her, but for the witnesses, for the law, for Rome itself. The pronuba spoke, her voice formal and ritualistic. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when necessary, ensuring the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor, where slaves waited with fresh water and linen. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. At dawn, Glaucus returned for the final examination. This confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided formal testimony regarding what she had witnessed. The transformation was complete. Flavia Marcella was now a Roman wife. She would bear 5 children over the next 14 years. She would manage Marcus's household competently, supervise 23 slaves, maintain relationships with his business partners' wives. She would attend festivals and fulfill all duties expected of a matrona of her class. And she would never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged. Because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Her silence wasn't unusual. It was universal. Roman women didn't write about their wedding nights. Roman men didn't describe what they witnessed serving as legal observers. The rituals were so embedded in Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary, like describing how one breathes or eats. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence wasn't conspiracy. It was the silence of water to fish. The medium was so omnipresent that those swimming in it couldn't see it as strange. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their bodies through this lens, prepared their daughters with whispered warnings that taught acceptance. The system perpetuated itself because everyone involved accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end came not from internal Roman reform, but from external religious conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought fundamentally different premises. If women had souls equal to men, they couldn't be treated as property requiring examination. If marriage was a sacred mystery, it couldn't include elements the church considered obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive to God. The transition took centuries and was never complete. But in cities and among educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed. And the suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of Mutunus Tutunus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed over. The pronuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial, a matron who simply accompanied the bride and offered blessings. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars studying fragmentary surviving sources. The Christians who transformed Rome weren't simply erasing embarrassing history. They were trying to build a new civilization on Roman foundations, while denying what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded so thoroughly that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality of verification, documentation, and witnessed consummation. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. In Augustine's outraged descriptions, in Arnobius's carefully vague language, in legal texts that mention witnesses to consummation without explaining why witnesses were necessary, in medical manuals that describe examination techniques without questioning why brides needed to be examined, in archaeological remains of household shrines where small carved phalluses were found, devotional objects related to Mutunus Tutunus, buried when Christianity made their worship dangerous. Flavia died in the year 129 CE, at approximately 56 years old. She'd been a wife for 38 years. What did she think about her wedding night and all those decades that followed? Did she remember it as trauma, as acceptance, as something between? Did she wish something different for her daughters? Or did she accept that this was simply how things were, how they had to be, how the world worked? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence that surrounds these practices is the silence of women whose experiences weren't considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies weren't considered relevant to the histories and legal texts that men produced. We know what was done to them. We don't know what they thought about what was done, but we know enough to see why this history was erased. It unsettles the civilization we inherited. Rome, hailed as the root of Western law and reason, also subjected women to ritualized control, civilization and brutality coexisted. Legal sophistication lived beside dehumanization. The rituals are gone, but the women were real. Flavia Marcella, her mother, her daughter's bodies turned into evidence, lives endured, remembered by no one, across generations of imposed silence. Except now. Now we know what the torches lit. Now we know what the witnesses saw. Now we know what Rome tried to erase, what Christianity tried to bury, what comfortable history tried to forget. The marble is still beautiful. The Latin is still elegant. The law is still admired. But on certain nights, if you listen carefully to the spaces between the words in ancient texts, you can almost hear them. The brides walking barefoot across cold floors toward draped figures in corners, the trembling, the silence. The moment when tradition revealed its true face, and there was nowhere left to run.